Welcome. You're just in time. The fire's just getting going, and we're about to start on 5 great stories on today's episode of Cozy Horror with me, Dr. Plague. So, let's get rolling on another great batch of stories while we sit around and get toasty by the fire. This first story is a little out of season, but it's one of my favorites, and I hope it's one of yours. Let's hear a story about some campers out doing what campers do best, telling stories. This one in particular, however, turns out to be a little more fact than fiction. So let's hear a tale about the Whispering Hole. The cabin in the woods had been abandoned for years, but one night, a candle burned in the window. We all tried our best to look appropriately terrified, but it was all mostly for show. Jesse liked to tell stories, but none of them were really that scary. The 5 of us were gathered around a flashlight in our bunkhouse, telling scary stories and generally just creeping each other out. Mike had a sack of junk food he'd snuck in, and Paul had a bottle of pop. We were enjoying just hanging out together more than any of the stories. These were the moments I looked forward to, the gathering of friends as we hung out for the summer. I've been going to Blue Lake Summer Camp for about 4 years now, and what I look forward to the most was spending time with the friends I only got to see at the camp. Jesse, Paul, Steve, and Mike, we had all been going to camp for about the same amount of time, and we'd become fast friends. They all lived in different places and didn't go to school with me, so the only time I got to see them was at summer camp. I didn't have a lot of friends at school, so I lived for their emails and the summers I got to spend with them. "That story sucks," came a voice from the back. We all looked up to see the 6th member of our cabin, Terry Woods, as he lay under his covers reading a comic book. Terry had been coming to camp for about as long as I can remember. He was a weird kid who never really got along with anyone. He'd been through 4 different cabins in 4 years, and I guess it was our turn to get him. He was quiet, didn't really do sports, and just kind of seemed like a creep. He was constantly hiding in the bushes and making people feel uncomfortable, and the counselors had even caught him peeking into bathroom stalls before. They kept talking about kicking him out, but every year he showed up with his bag and a check, so they let him stay. It's probably the only break his parents got from him, and who could really begrudge them a little downtime? Jesse turned to Terry and fixed him with a frustrated look. Jesse hated hearing that his stories were lame, even though most of them were. "All right then, smart guy, why don't you come tell a story? Show us what a real scary story looks like." Terry seemed to think about it for a minute, before putting down his comic book and walking over to sit on the bed with us. We made a space for him that was a little too big, since none of us really wanted to sit next to Terry. He looked into the flashlight beam, and it was like being around a campfire. The light made his skin pale and ghostly, and when Terry looked up, we all sat back a little in surprise. He looked like a corpse, and he seemed to know it. "You guys ever hear the story of the Whispering Hole?" A few of us shook our heads, but Paul nodded. "Some of the older boys told me about it. It's a hole in the woods, and they say you can hear Indian ghosts in it or something." Terry nodded, grinning a little. "Legend says that it's not Indian ghosts in that hole. The story I heard was that long, long ago, a bunch of superstitious farmers buried their kids out there to appease a forest spirit so he would give them good crops." We all leaned in close now, expecting a good story with a lead-up like that. "They say when the land was first settled and all the Creek Indians were safely chased out of the woods, the crops began to fail. An old woman, whom the townsfolk suspected was a witch, told the people that they had angered a forest spirit, and now their crops would do badly. When they asked what they had to do to bring the crops back, she said that they must take one of their children for every year they had settled here and bury them in a deep hole in the woods. Only then would the crops grow again, and the spirit would be appeased." We had leaned in closer, our shadows magnified against the roof of the cabin. The townsfolk realized that this meant 8 of their children would need to be sacrificed. So through a lottery, they decided which 8 must be taken. The rich tried to buy their way out, and the poor tried to beg their way out. But in the end, those whose names were drawn were taken to the woods. They were led there by the witch, and some of the men from the village came along too. Suddenly, the ground opened up to accept their sacrifice, and they herded the children into that space. When the last one fell into the earth, the forest erupted in a mighty roar. The crops grew, and the town prospered. But if the townspeople needed to be reminded of the price they paid for their prosperity, they had only to visit the hole in the woods and hear the whispers of the children. The town is gone now, but the hole whispers eternally. We sat in silence for a moment, all of us looking at each other as the story came to an end. Terry had created something special here, but none of us believed it. It was just a story, plain and simple. Or so we thought. "Wow," Jesse said. "Gotta give it to you, Ter. That was a good story." "Oh, it's no story," Terry said. "The hole exists. I've been there." We were silent for a few seconds. Then we all began to laugh, thinking Terry was just making a joke. All of us, except for Terry, that was. As the laughter died, we all looked at his deadpan stare and realized he was serious. "You want to go?" Terry asked. The five of us looked at each other. Did we want to go out in the woods with someone we didn't quite trust and didn't really like? I already figured I knew how the rest would answer, but when Jesse spoke up, it came as a bit of a surprise. "Sure, let's go see this whispering hole. You're in, right?" he said, looking right at me. I surprised myself by nodding, but the other three shook their heads almost at once. Mike was afraid. "It could be dangerous out there. I don't think I want to go." Steve was condescending. "There's no whispering hole. Terry's just trying to play a trick on us, guys." Paul was sensible. "We should get some sleep, guys. Counselor Hank said there was going to be a big hike tomorrow, and we don't want to be tired for it." In the end, though, Jesse wouldn't be turned away, and I certainly wasn't going to let him go by himself. So, Terry, Jesse, and I snuck out of our cabin and trotted off into the woods with only the moon to guide us. "So," Jesse asked, "where is this whispering hole?" "Not far," Terry said, leading the way. "The camp's actually pretty close. It's about a mile, I guess." Jesse balked at that. "A mile? That could take us nearly an hour in the dark." Terry grinned that same jack-o'-lantern grin at him. "Then I guess you better start walking and stop talking." Then he headed off into the woods, and it was either follow him or turn around. At this point, turning around didn't seem like much of an option, so Jesse and I went. The woods were alive in a way that we had never seen during the day. I saw a pair of eyes looming overhead a second before an owl took flight. The crickets hit a reeing point that was close to eye-watering. The sounds of squirrels and birds were replaced by night creatures that were just beginning to come alive. With the moon on high and the wind rustling the overhead canopy, we felt immersed in an alien world the deeper we went into the woods. This was different than the camping we did. This felt almost dangerous, and it was exhilarating to three young boys in the woods alone at night. We followed Terry for about 45 minutes, all of us sweating and waving off the clouds of mosquitoes, before Jesse asked him if he was lost. "No, I know where we're going. It's just a little farther." He had picked up a large limb and was using it as a makeshift machete as he thwacked at the branches. I'd found a stick of my own, a large one that I was using as a walking stick, and I saw Jesse looking around for a stick of his own. The way he was doing it, though, made it seem weird. He wasn't looking around in that lackadaisical way that kids look for sticks. Jesse seemed to be looking for a stick with a purpose. "You okay?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Jesse started to answer, but grinned as he found a big stick that looked like a club. He picked it up and took some test swings before turning back to me. "Much better now. I feel way better now that I have something to defend myself with." "You hear something following us?" I asked, looking around to see if I could spot it. "It's more what we're following. I don't really know Terry. Do you?" I shook my head, ducking a low-hanging arm of a pine bough, and yet, here we are, following him into God knows what. "You buy his story about a whispering hole?" I don't know. "Not really," I said with a little shrug. "So then, where's he really taking us? Is this some kind of psycho crap? I want to be ready if it is." I realized that I had done the same thing without thinking about it, and tested the end of my walking stick against the dirt. It was a sorry excuse for a walking cane, but I supposed it was better than nothing. Watching the back of our guide, I suddenly wondered if we could take Terry if it came to it. Terry was fat, but he was also bigger than either Jesse or I. I had seen him play soccer once, and he seemed slow and easily winded. If he got his hands on you, though, I wondered what might happen. He could probably hurt one of us really bad, and then it would be up to the other to either fight him off or run for help. At a mile, I didn't like the thought of having to run all the way back to camp, but I liked the idea of running while Terry stalked me through the woods even less. It didn't matter, though. Not really. Once we came to the hole, it was all irrelevant. The closer we got to our destination, the quieter it seemed to become in the forest. The sounds of night birds and insects softened at first, like sounds heard with the TV volume turned down. But the deeper we went, the more they seemed to become actually silent. We were soon walking through a silent forest, and it made my skin crawl. Forests aren't supposed to be like that, and the idea that something actually lay ahead made me break out in goosebumps. What could it be that had scared all the wildlife away? What could it be, and what would it do to 3 kids who just wandered into its territory? Terry suddenly stopped, declaring that we were there. He stepped past a little ring of trees, and we followed him. Terry had the stick balanced on his shoulder, but when we came into the open space, he pointed at the hole with the gnarled branch. "There it is, boys, the whispering hole, just like I promised." We turned to look, and I could see Jesse's fingers were white as he clutched his club. When we saw the hole, though, those fingers seemed to become boneless, and the stick spilled out of them. He stepped towards the hole like a drowning man paddling for a raft, and I felt equally as moved. The whispering hole wasn't a hole at all. It was like nothing so much as a grave. The grave was about 6 feet tall and 6 feet across. The earth had not been dug out, despite the amount of it sitting on either side of the hole. The way it looked, the earth had simply spat the dirt out like a mouthful of spinach, to have its mouth free of the taste. The pit was deep, too, and Jesse and I bent over to look down into the black mouth of that chasm. The whispering was slight, sounded more like a babbling brook than actual whispering. Jesse made a rude noise, looking back at Terry as he rolled his eyes. "It's just an underground river. You drug us all the way out here to show us an underground river?" Terry shrugged, but his grin never faltered. "It's the whispering hole. Have a listen. They say you can hear the voices of those dead kids down there." Jesse bent over, listening to the sound coming up, but that seemed like a great way to topple into the hole. Instead, I laid down on my stomach, putting my ear over the hole and listening to the sounds inside. I had worried about the edge of the pit crumbling and sending Jesse falling in, but the edge of the pit seemed to be made of stone. It reminded me of nothing so much as one of those random caves you sometimes find in Minecraft. Those openings in the earth that just wait to be found. I had wanted to see if I could squint and see the bottom, but it was too far down to see anything. I wondered how we were hearing the water when a voice whispered up into my ear. "Beware, he's gonna push you in." I looked down into the pit and then over at Jesse, who was straining his ears and looking in. Who had said that? He's pushed so many into the whispering hole. Sometimes it's people he knows. Sometimes it's people from camp. But it's always him. Get out. Get out while you still can. I turned to see if Jesse was hearing this, but that was when Terry made his move. I looked up just in time to see him shove Jesse with both hands, sending him falling into the hole. I rolled before I could really think about it, and it saved me from getting a tennis shoe to the face. Terry was still smiling, but his foot was coming down again and again as he tried to stomp me. I was scared, moving purely off adrenaline, and when I sprang back to my feet, he lifted his stick like he meant to club me. He didn't say anything. He just ran forward with that gnarled branch he had been using to clear the path. I threw my own stick at him and turned, running into the woods as I tried to make it back to camp. I had to let someone know what had happened out here. I ran through the forest like a startled deer, but it seemed like something was stalking me. Something big was behind me, and the farther I ran, the louder and more frantic it became. I felt like Snow White as I ran through the woods, the once enchanting landscape now little more than a nightmare forest that grabbed at me with every step. The pine boughs whipped my face, the rocks and palmettos sliced at my shins, and the constant rustling of something behind me kept me on edge. Every time I would think about stopping or slowing down, I would hear it, and it would pique my adrenaline again. I could have run for hours as I dodged the large something, but eventually I saw the familiar lights of the camp not far ahead of me. The closer I got, the more I expected that frantic rustling to crop up again. It had seemed to chase me all the way from the whispering hole, and I could just see Terry stalking me as he tried to stop me from tattling. What would he do if he caught me? Would he club me with that branch? Or would he just drag me back to the hole and toss me in? When I broke free of the woods and made it back to those familiar cabins, I felt blessed indeed. The scoutmaster came after a few minutes of steady knocking, and he looked grumpy. When I told him what had happened, though, he woke up pretty quick. He pulled me into the cabin and took my statement as he called the police. The police came and had me take them to the Whispering Hole immediately. Most of them looked like just regular cops, but a few had bags of climbing gear for spelunking. The scoutmaster and I went with the 8 officers and 1 dog, and as the woods got quieter again, I knew we were getting close. When we came into the clearing, I didn't see any sign of Terry anywhere. The guys with the bags looked over the edge of the hole, and with their spotlights, they found Jesse as he lay at the bottom. I was so afraid that he was dead, but one of the officers said that he was moving some when they shone the light on him. They told me later that we had both been very lucky, since Jesse had fallen almost 50 feet into the underground cave. Both his legs were broken, badly broken at that, and he had hit his head pretty hard, but he was alive. The guys with the bags went down to get him, a stretcher coming down on a cord, and when they got there, one of them said that they'd need some body bags after they got the kid airlifted out. There's about 6 other bodies down here, and all of them look like children. Most of this stuff the police either asked me about, or it was stuff that I picked up when I wasn't supposed to be listening, but it paints a pretty grisly picture of Terry's crimes. Well, not Terry, I guess, since there is no Terry. Terry had taken 6 other kids to the hole, 2 of them campers from the previous year, and just shoved them in. He had made up the story of the Whispering Hole to take other kids out to the spot so he could push them in and listen to them die. A few of the bodies had clearly died on impact, but the coroner said that a few of them had probably lived for a day or 2 as they sat out there dying. The sicko had probably come to check up on them as they lay bleeding to death, and it appeared he had meant to make us his next 2 victims. There's a manhunt going on right now for Terry, but the camp has relatively little information on him. The address they have goes to an empty lot in a trailer park. Terry pays by cashier check every year, and the phone number they have on file goes to a disconnected number. They've never met Terry's mother or father, and they have no idea where he lives. They know that he lives close to the Whispering Hole, but the chances of finding him might be slim if he lives in the woods somewhere with relatives. The camp has agreed to call if he turns up, but camp is definitely canceled this year for Jesse and I. Mom says I can visit him in the hospital if I want, and the paramedics told me that he wouldn't be alive if it wasn't for me. So do yourself a favor, and don't listen to any stories about the Whispering Hole if they're told around the campfire this year. Terry will need a new hunting ground, and he may be coming to a summer camp near you.
A roaring fire always puts me in the mood to roast some marshmallows. One of these days I should probably bring some. I always forget to buy them when I'm out. Going from jabbering scouts to jabbering ravens, let's hear a little story about one of my new favorite cryptids, and a little something I call the Valraven's deal. I grew up outside of Copenhagen. Most of my life spent on my father's sheep farm. It's beautiful country if you've never been, and I can think of no better place to spend my childhood. The rolling hills and forests are perfect for playing knights or policemen or whatever a child may want. The trees became my castles, the underbridges my banks or shops to chase robbers from, and I spent the hours outside of my chores letting my imagination run wild. That imagination was probably why no one believed me when I told them about the ravens. I'd been telling tales since I was very young. I claimed I'd seen fairies dancing around a mushroom ring. I'd seen a parade of lights that had turned out to be the procession of Queen Mab, that I had seen dinosaurs in the forest, and black dogs, and kelpies, and all sorts of things. I loved stories, so I wanted to see something magical. The world was often such a dour place that I prayed for a little magic in my life, and created it until I could find my wish fulfilled. I was 9 when I found some of that magic, but I wasn't quite as ready as I believed I was. My grandparents lived less than a mile from our farm. Their property was at the back end of ours, truth be told, and when my gran called and said She had just baked a bunch of cookies and was hoping I could come help her eat some of the extras. I turned hopefully to my mum and asked if I could go over for some cookies. Mum asked if my chores were done, and I said they were. It was summer. I wouldn't have to go fill the sheep feeders till after dinner. I'd been diligent through the day, and now my midday was mine to do what I liked. "You may," Mum said, "but put on your slicker and your wellies. It looks like rain." A few minutes later, I was set out in my duck-yellow slicker with my big green rubber gum boots on an adventure to Grandma's house. I found a stick on the way, my sword for this quest, and I was cutting through the sheep fields and heading for the little path between the fields. It was a place I liked to play sometimes, and my grandfather had told me it had once been the site of a great battle. He said old Danish kings were known to make war on each other, and the land around Copenhagen had seen a lot of bloodshed over the years. The area between the farms, but a quarter-mile of dirt road, was said to have been the site of several skirmishes, and I wonder now how many had lost their lives there. As a child, however, it was just fun to think of knights fighting each other as their steel clanged and the horses whinnied. I heard the thunder rumble, something that was not the loud sound of hooves charging forward, and thought that Mum was right. The rain would be coming soon. If I didn't want to get wet, I needed to hurry. Getting wet wasn't really something I was too worried about, but Gran liked to keep the house nice and dry, and a wet little boy was likely to be asked to leave after he'd eaten only a few cookies. I came out onto the road, racing the rain, but I wasn't alone. Perched on the wooden fence which separated the road from the fields were ravens. I don't mean crows or blackbirds. I mean ravens. If you've never seen them together, then you might not understand, but ravens are quite a bit larger than crows. They are more than a little scary looking, too, especially to a child not yet 10. I expected they would take flight when I came onto the road, but they did not. They sat looking at me like hateful old men watching a trespasser, and it was clear that they would not leave simply because I was there. They were proud birds, and this was their place, and it was I who was the interloper. It was spooky, but I wasn't really afraid of them. I was a little scared. There were a lot of them, and I was a small boy, but I didn't think they would hurt me. These were no boogeymen, no trolls or goblins, and they were more spooky than scary. Papa put out straw men to keep these devils out of the garden. They were birds, and birds couldn't hurt me. "Boy," said a voice, and I froze in my tracks. "Boy," it said again, and I looked around to see who had spoken. Was it one of the ravens? Ravens could speak. I'd heard that somewhere, and maybe these ravens had picked up a word or two. Mum said ravens were smart after all, so it wasn't that hard to imagine that it could be them talking. I kept walking, trying not to look at them as I went. They were just birds. They didn't want anything from me. Birds didn't talk to people. They just, "Boy, stop," the same croaky voice said. That drew me up short. The bird had told me to stop, so I had. I felt a chill run up my spine as I turned to look at the group of crows. A murder. It was a murder when it was crows. And I saw one that was different. His feathers were white. They weren't gray. They were snow white. His beak and legs were black, the color his feathers ought to be, but his eyes were the most frightening part of him. They were red, like a rat's eyes, and they stared at me with far too much intelligence. We just stood there for a while, staring at each other as the thunder built overhead, and I started to wonder if I had imagined the whole thing. It was still just a bird, so it had 2 words. What of it? Didn't mean it was different from the rest or anything. "Thank you, boy," it said, its speech perfectly understandable, if not a little raspy. "I was not sure you would stop for a moment. I have to ask a favor of you, but in return I will grant you any wish you desire." I looked around, expecting to see someone standing nearby throwing their voice, but it was just me and the ravens. The thunder rumbled again overhead, but the rain, coming on fast behind me, was the least of my concerns. Now I was more worried about the talking raven with the white feathers. I started to say, not sure how to answer. "Are you talking to me?" The raven appeared to chuckle, a clicking sound that the others picked up quickly. "Well, who else would I be talking to? You and I are the only ones talking out here, are we not?" I nodded, supposing that was so. "So I am here to offer you your heart's desire in exchange for a favor of my asking. Do you agree?" I started to nod. I was very close to just nodding before learning more, but Papa had always been very clear about blindly accepting things. Papa was a man who had worked to get where he was, and he always told me to be wary of deals that seemed too good to be true. Anyone who wants you to sign on the dotted line without letting you read the contract is trying to trick you out of something, and it's often something you wouldn't want to try to live without, he would say, and I remembered his words in the nick of time. "How is it that you can talk?" I asked, and the bird ruffled a little at the question. "Well, ravens are smart, everyone knows this, but I am a Val Raven, and I am smarter than any of my brethren. Do you know why?" I did know why, as it happened. Grandfather had told me about the Val Ravens, just as he had told me about the trolls and the gnomes and the other magical creatures that inhabit our old world. "Val Ravens are ravens that have eaten the flesh of a king," I said, and the bird seemed to smile as much as a beak could smile. "Very close, boy. Val Ravens have eaten the heart of a king. It was right here, actually, a very long time ago. Would you like to hear about it?" I nodded. "Very much. My grandfather told me this place had seen many battles." "Your grandfather is wise," the white bird said. "I was barely in my first year when I saw the pinions and banners waving. We were more interested in the men carrying them, however, my murder and I. In those days, when men with banners went somewhere, they were often bodies in the place where they stopped to do battle. Banners we were following that day. They did not do well, and we fell on them after the fighting was done and ate our fill. I found him then, the man with the shiny hat. I did not know he was a king, not then. I only knew that his hat had caught the light when the sun came out from behind a cloud, and it drew me to him. His armor was broken, and his blood was running free. Someone had pierced his heart with a lance, and I ate it happily. It was meat, and meat was good. But as I ate, I began to know things. I knew that the meat was a heart, and the hat was a crown, and the king was named Lenthal. His castle was far from here, in a place called Wales, and he would never go home again. Never again. I also knew something else. I knew I would never die until I gained what I needed. I would never truly live. That is why I need you, boy. You have what I need, and to get it, I am willing to make a deal with you. Whatever you desire shall be yours, but only if you agree to give me what I need. For the second time that day, I was prepared to agree. My family was not rich, though we were better than most, and there were things I needed, just like any child. A new bike, a box kite, a real sword, a horse, a stable of horses. I could have anything I wanted. The Valraven was magic. Grandfather had said so. But as I opened my mouth, I remembered something else Grandfather had told me. The Valraven is a smart but tricksy bird. It knows it can only be human if it gains what it most desires, he had said, puffing his pipe as he sat before the fire. And what does it most desire, Grandfather? I asked, scooting a little closer as I waited for him to tell. I expected it to be treasure or a magic book or true love or something from the usual stories, but it was much worse than that. My grandfather leaned back and looked me in the eye as he delivered the answer, and I realized now that it had been intended to scare me. Grandfather believed in the things he talked about, trolls and redcaps and Valraven, and he wanted me to be wary of them as well. After that night, I certainly was wary, and it surprises me now that it took me so long to remember that night as I sat before the fire, listening to the tales. A child's heart, he almost whispered, and as I stood there in the road, I heard that same whisper creep up my spine like a spider in the dead of night. "Do we have a deal?" the Valraven asked, but I was already backing away. I shouldn't have talked to it. I shouldn't have stopped. And as I began to run, I heard the Valraven quark angrily as the murder took flight. I was running as fast as I could, the raindrops beginning to fall as my feet ate up the ground. I could see the lane that would take me to my grandparents' house, but it looked miles long as the beat of wings sounded behind me. There were so many of them, a whole murder of them, and I fancied that my slicker rustled as they dove at me. The rain was falling hard now, the drops becoming a downpour, and I expected their talons to find me any minute. When the angry quark began to sound behind me, I looked back to see them flying drunkenly as the rain soaked them. Later I would find out that birds don't usually fly in the rain because it makes their feathers heavy, which makes their movements difficult and their steering and maintaining flight almost impossible. If they had come after me on a sunny day, I would have been ripped apart. Ravens are large, and in such numbers, I would have been unable to hold them off. Instead, the rain thwarted them, and I made it to my grandparents' house in one piece. Grandma was a little miffed at the mud and the water that I had tracked in, but I think she realized something was wrong when she found me curled up in a corner of her mudroom in tears. She asked me what had happened, clearly afraid that someone had tried to snatch me or some such thing, but I just kept shaking my head and whispering, Valraven, Valraven, until she called my grandfather from the den and asked him what I was saying. Grandfather listened. He nodded, and then he took me in his arms and brought me into the den to sit by the fire. Grandmother came in a few minutes later with cookies and milk, and we sat and listened to the rain, Grandfather asking me if I'd seen one of the tricksy birds. I nodded, and he nodded in return. That was all that was ever said about it. After my cookies were eaten, he put me in his old truck and took me home. We never spoke of it again, and it was never brought up between anyone after that.
How's that one for a little bit of childhood trauma? We all see weird things when we're kids, but there's something about a group of talking ravens after something like that just gives me the willies. Speaking of giving me the willies, let's hear one of my stranger stories about something very personal that happens, luckily, not very often. Let's hear a story about the touch of a stranger. It should have been the least stressful part of his day, but it was something that Steve would never quite get over. The kids had been bugging him to take them to the fair all week, but Steve would have rather taken off his skin with a cheese grater. He'd been working all week, his legs were killing him, and that wasn't the biggest issue at play either. The thought of bumping elbows and shoulders with people in a setting like that made him feel squeeby just thinking about it, though Steve would never admit to it. Steve had been plagued with haphophobia since he was young. It had been worse when he was younger. Steve hadn't even wanted his parents to touch him, but the thought of strangers touching him would send him into a near catatonic state. He spent years telling people not to touch him, avoiding hugs and handshakes, and stepping around people if they got too close. This set him apart from his peers and made him a bit of an outsider. After years of work and a lot of therapy, he'd gotten past some of it, but he still really didn't like to be touched by people he didn't know. Seeing his kids upset was hard, but Steve just couldn't bring himself to plunge into that kind of environment. Not until his wife had guilted him about it. "I think you ought to take the kids to the fair, Steve." He'd been half asleep, but snorted awake as he rolled over to look at her. The two were in bed, Lisa having gotten off a little earlier than usual, and they were looking forward to a much-needed night of sleep. Steve had nodded, ready to slip off into oblivion, when Lisa had spoken up. "Huh?" Steve asked, as articulate as ever. "You should take them to the fair. It means a lot to them. I'd do it myself if I didn't have to work until 11 on Saturday." "I'm just..." Steve grasped for an excuse that would make her let him sleep and drop the conversation. "So tired from work. The boss has been working us hard, and I don't really think I have the energy to putter around the fair." She rolled over, wrapping her arms around him as he leaned back against her. Lisa would never know how much work it had taken to get to this point, and he never intended to let her find out. He had never told her about his mental issues. He was afraid that she would see him as weak or an oddball and might leave him because of it. He doubted it. They had been married for years, but it was always something in the back of his mind. I know it's been a long week for you, but it would make your kids happy. Please, for me." Steve wanted to tell her no, but it was hard to say no when she was pressed up against him. There weren't many people Steve could stand to have this close. The list was very short. Lisa, the kids, and maybe his mother. He wanted to make her happy, wanted to make the kids happy. So, despite his better judgment, he agreed to take them. So, just before sunset on Saturday night, Steve found the three of them standing at the ticket booth just outside the teeming throng of people that made up the town fair. Even now, he could feel the presence of the crowd. It teemed with life, the sweating masses that would push at him, their skin rubbing at him as he and his kids walked by. The odor was nauseating, even from here, and Steve could feel his skin crawl as he paid the ticket taker with shaky hands. As they headed through the rusty chain link surrounding the fairground with his oldest, Robbie, and his youngest, Charles,
Steve knew this would be the biggest test of his mental health in some time. From the instant he stepped inside, he could feel the combined weight of the crowd pressing against him. No one actually touched him. They were a little too polite for that. But the oppressive nature of so many people moving around him was still a lot. The combined smell of sugary fair food, stale sweat, cigarette smoke, and the puff of dry earth from the fairground was like a cloud around him. The warmth of so many people so close to him and his kids reminded him of being too warm in his winter clothes. It was stifling, the miasma of emotions at odds with the smiling faces of his kids, and Steve tried to keep it together as his skin threatened to crawl right off his body. At first, Steve believed he could distract himself from all this. The food smelled good, but it was hard to keep it down with the combined smells of humanity wafting around him. Fried this and battered that went into his stomach, but even the culinary oddities couldn't keep his anxiety at bay. People sat too close to him, their heat radiating into his skin, and Steve began to feel claustrophobic as the crowd pressed against him outside the food tent. Due to COVID protocol, the fair had to ask guests to only eat in designated areas, but that didn't seem to be stopping most of them from walking around with small buffets in their arms. As he came out of the tent like a man who's seen a ghost, Steve thought maybe the rides would be a better distraction. The rides looked fun, but the seats were so close that it was hard to quantify as a distraction. Every ride pushed him closer to his fellow riders, and their skin on his was unbearable. No matter how close he pulled his arms in, no matter how small he made himself, he could still feel the warm, sweaty, disgusting feeling of the other riders beside him as their rubbery flesh pushed against his. He spent every ride feeling more and more like he wanted to crawl out of his own skin, and when Charles reached for his hand at the end of every ride, it took everything he had to grasp it. He felt ready to puke, ready to scream, and after a while he just let the kids ride the rides as he sat back and tried to keep control of himself. Rob and Charles had gone off to ride a collection of rides around the bench that he was sitting on, and as they moved, Steve moved as well. He was aware that they could get snatched pretty easily in this environment, but Rob was stocky for his age, and Steve hoped his size would dissuade anyone from messing with him or his little brother. As he sat on the metal bench, almost feeling the heat of every ass that had touched it before, he wanted to pull his knees up to his chest and feel the comfortable bump of his heart against his kneecaps. He hadn't done that since he was a kid, something that had driven his mother crazy, but he longed for that comfortable press now as the unnamed masses flooded around him. Steve would have never believed that there were so many people in this small town, but it appeared they were all on display tonight. The crowd was thick as they wove up the asphalt path, and Steve felt for his inhaler before realizing it was also something he hadn't used since high school. As the hyperventilation threatened to overtake him, a new player joined the game in the form of a loud groan in his guts. Steve wasn't sure if it had been the deep-fried Oreos or the batter-fried Twinkies, but they had put his stomach in an uproar. He could feel his guts bubbling, the rides clearly doing more harm than good in that respect. He made eye contact with Rob, cutting his eyes to the porta-potty and nodding his head towards it. Rob seemed to struggle with the implications for a moment, eyes darting between his dad and the little plastic shit box, before he finally put the pieces together and gave his dad a thumbs up. Steve was off the bench like a shot, his guts feeling like they were full of eels, and he locked the door as it clattered shut behind him. As he let his jeans hit the floor of the filthy bathroom, Steve felt a wave of calm roll through him. That might sound strange, feeling at ease in a disgusting toilet, but as his backside hit the plastic seat and the sound of the fair buzzed softly outside the rough walls, Steve found that the isolation was what he'd been seeking. Here it was just him and his thoughts, and he breathed a sigh of relief for the first time that night. As he did his business, he felt a sense of ease take the place of the anxiety he had felt for the last few hours. It felt like he might be able to return to the fair now, his burbling guts appeased as he purged the combination of fried foods. He heard his leavings splash below him, but didn't get up immediately. Steve wanted just a few more minutes, a few more seconds of quiet, and he would sometimes wonder if that had been his downfall. The universe, it seems, had found him greedy, and his punishment came a half a second before his eyes opened. He stiffened as he felt it, and could feel every hair on his body standing at attention. Something had touched him. It felt like a finger, just the pad of a single digit, but the feel was unmistakable as it caressed his inner thigh. Steve was frozen, his ease and peace gone as fast as the sour mash that had brought him here. This couldn't be real. Nothing was below him. Nothing that could touch him, at any rate. His anxiety was playing tricks on him, but if it was very convincing. He could feel it creeping up his thigh, going higher and higher. As it threatened to invade something too intimate for his mind to accept, Steve felt himself surge forward, falling onto the floor as his pants tripped his scrambling legs. In the murky light of the porta-potty, Steve saw something as it descended back into the muck of the tank. It was clearly a hand, the finger extended, and as he tried to press himself through the plastic portal to the noisy outside world, he saw it rise from the muck. It was a man, thin as a rail, who seemed to grow taller as he rose from the cesspool. His arms were cartoonishly long, their length dripping with noxious sludge. As he smiled, Steve saw teeth that looked too big for a normal mouth. The crap fell off him with thick plops, a sound that would haunt his dreams for years to come, and when he leaned down to loom over him, Steve felt sure that he would simply unhinge his jaw and swallow him up. Then he slid back into the repulsive stew like a reverse jack-in-the-box, and Steve felt the door open to release him into the barely lighted world. When Steve came scrambling out of the stall, his pants still around his ankles, he was screaming for help. There's something in there. There's something in the tank," he yelled, people gathering as he tried to get his pants up again. The police may have taken their time, but the fair workers had already quartered off the toilet. People watched the door, not wanting to let anyone get out, and the crowd that surrounded Steve was very supportive. He was sitting on the same bench he had run from, a blanket around him as he tried to ignore the well-meaning strangers who tried to comfort him. He'd told the crowd what had happened, blushing at the details as he relived them, and the police arrived about the same time the pumper truck did. His son sat beside him, comforting him as he sat shaking, and he was glad for the firmness of their hands this time. An officer took his statement as the men with the hose set to work. They were using a small pumper hose, not wanting to accidentally suck up whoever might be in there, and Steve couldn't help but watch the hose jiggle and jounce as they emptied the tank. The officers had just finished taking his statement, telling Steve they would get the guy, when the truck driver came up and spoke in a low voice to the officer. The officer rolled his eyes and nodded, flipping the notebook closed as he started to go. "Wait," Steve stammered, aren't you going to arrest the guy?" "Tank's empty, sir. There's no one in there." But, Steve started, his anxiety rising again. That's impossible. I saw it. I saw it with my own eyes." "Be that as it may, tank's empty, sir. It's a crime to misuse law enforcement, sir. I'd suggest you let me get back to work." As they left, so too left the crowd, many of them now whispering darkly as Steve and his sons were left sitting on the bench. They had left then, the fair mostly over by this point, but it seemed the mistrust came with them. If you didn't want to take us, you should have just said so instead of doing something like that." They'd been driving home when Rob said it, and when Steve looked in the rearview mirror, his son appeared on the verge of rage tears. "I didn't make it up," Steve said, wanting to take offense of his son's tone, but understanding his embarrassment. "I know what I saw." Charles was silent, his embarrassment harder for his 6-year-old mind to put into words, but Rob seemed to have a pretty good grasp on his anger. "Yeah, right," he said, looking out the window sullenly. The drive home seemed to take forever, but it still wasn't long enough for Steve to find a rebuttal. His sons piled out when they got home, and Steve could only watch as they went inside and slammed the door behind them. He wanted to be angry. He wanted to rail against his oldest for the way he'd talked to him, but as the anxiety and the shame built up inside him, all he could do was lean his head against the steering wheel and sob silently into the unyielding rubber. He felt violated, doubly so after the judging whispers of the crowd, and he knew the shame wouldn't wash off in the shower. The isolation he felt now brought none of the comfort it had earlier, and as Steve tried to make sense of what he felt, he knew it wouldn't make any difference. He just sat in the driveway, crying into his steering wheel, his impotence almost worse than the fear of being touched. The stranger who had touched him tonight would remain a stranger, and that fact was the worst part of all to Steve.
Whew, gotta get a few more logs for the fire at this rate. It's getting chilly out there, and a well-built-up fire is always nice to have around. Let's move on to a subject that's a little closer to home for me. After a writer passes, sometimes their stories pass too, but sometimes a writer's desire to continue creating can last beyond the grave. So, if you listen hard, you too might hear the tapping of the keys.
My dad died nearly 2 years ago, and we just buried him today. He was a writer, though you've probably never heard of him. He was known in small circles, celebrated by the community where he lived, but his books will likely never grace the shelves of Barnes and Nobles. I say that like it's a fact, but that may not be the case anymore. Dad, much like one of those painters from the 1800s, became infinitely more famous in his death than he ever was in life. People who wouldn't return his calls, wouldn't even think of publishing his work, now come to see him from miles away. This probably seems strange, given that I just told you that he's dead, so let me start at the beginning. Dad died as he lived, at his keyboard. He's been writing the same book for as long as I can remember. It's a massive 7 or 8 volume series. In one of my earliest memories, I can remember toddling into his office and looking up at him as he smiled down at me, his fingers never leaving the keyboard as he plinked away. Dad wrote other things for magazines or freelance work, but the books were his magnum opus. He would tell anyone who would listen, usually interested friends of mine who were aspiring writers themselves, how the book would be the greatest work once it was done. He had envisioned 10 books in all, detailing the hero's journey of his main character as he attempted to find his father's murderer across several continents, meeting people and finding clues along the way. I've heard him talk about that book almost every day since I was old enough to understand what he was talking about, but I couldn't tell you much about them. He never let anybody read them. He was so protective of them. I don't know more than a dozen people who were aware of its existence at all. That being said, he was always in his study when he had time, tapping away at the keys and refining his manuscript for the day that it would be picked up by an editor. I was the one who found him, and it will haunt me for the rest of my life. I was getting ready for college, packing up my things, moving out, and I came to see if he would help me move some furniture onto the truck. He'd been in his office all day, and I kind of thought maybe he was mad at me. I know he didn't want me to leave. He was sad to see me go, but he had to understand that I had to go to college. I had a full-ride scholarship. I'd be a fool not to use it, and living on campus would give me access to resources I wouldn't have at home. It seemed like the best choice to move out, and I couldn't believe he couldn't see that. So when I stuck my head in and asked him, I was surprised when he didn't turn around. That only seemed to cement in my head the idea that he was mad at me. He had his back to the door, as he always did, fingers tapping away, and when he didn't say anything, I just stood there and looked at the back of his head for a moment. He had a bald spot forming, the hair receding away from the center, and I thought it was a little sad to watch my dad aging in such an obvious way. I asked him again, his fingers never slowing, but when he didn't say anything, I just went downstairs and managed to manhandle the desk into the U-Haul by myself. I decided I wouldn't bother him if he wanted to act like this. He would fold when it came time for me to leave, apologizing for acting like this, and we would have a hug before I drove off into the sunset. Around lunchtime, I looked at my now empty room and realized I was finished packing. Mom was at work at the post office, and I had planned to swing in and say bye on my way out of town. We had said our goodbyes that morning, with a lot of tears and hugging over breakfast, and Dad was the only one I still needed to say goodbye to. So I went upstairs again, saying I needed to leave and wondering if he'd give me a hug. His fingers just kept tapping away uninterrupted. "Come on, Dad," I said, stepping inside as he continued to ignore me. "I know you're bummed about this, but it's time for me to get out of here and make my own way. It's not like I'll never see you again. I'll be here for Thanksgiving. That's less than..." But when I put my hand on his shoulder, I noticed how cold it was. Dad had been up here for 3 days writing, and Mom said she didn't think he'd come to bed in all that time. That wasn't uncommon for Dad. He would hyperfixate on a project, or revisions for days at a time. His office was towards the back of the house on the second floor, so without foot traffic or noise, he could lose himself for days as he worked. He usually came down for food after everyone was asleep, but I couldn't remember hearing him stumble around lately. I turned him towards me, his hands moving comically in front of him as he swung away from the desk, and as he came away, he began to scream as if someone was stabbing him. I stumbled away, taking in his long face and sunken eyes, and found myself running from the room as I grabbed the phone out of my pocket. Mom said she'd be home immediately, and as I waited downstairs, I could still hear him screaming in his office. She came home in a rush, going up the stairs 2 at a time, and when the screaming finally stopped, I breathed a sigh of relief. When she came downstairs, she asked me to come to his office. "I need to talk to you about something, and I think this should be a family decision." I came back to see that Dad was still staring at the screen of his MacBook, tapping away like we weren't even there. "I don't know how to explain this, but your father's dead." Looking at his fingers as they went about their tireless typing, I asked if she was kidding. Dad was clearly alive. His hands were moving, and I could see words on the screen forming coherent sentences. Were they playing a joke or something? None of what she was saying made any sense. I checked his pulse. He has no pulse, no vitals. He's gone, sweetie. But it appears that he's not quite gone. She tried to move him, and as she turned him away from the computer, I could see his lifeless face as it turned to regard me. His jaw had been hanging slack, his eyes open and staring, and as his hands came away from the keyboard, he started screaming all over again. It was deep and tortured, similar to the one he'd made before, and without even meaning to, I turned him back to the keyboard where his hands started typing again. I asked her what was going on, and Mom shrugged as she tried to come up with a reason for this. His book was important to him. You know that. I think maybe once he finishes it, he might stop on his own. I can't explain what's happening here, but I don't want him to die with his work unfinished. Your father kept saying it wasn't ready, but I'm going to send the first manuscript to his editor. Maybe once he sees it and someone puts it into print, he'll finally be able to rest. Either way, let's keep this between us, okay? I want your father to pass on without regrets, don't you? I nodded, telling her of course I did. I wanted Dad to die in peace. Then do him this last favor, and don't tell anyone what you've seen here. Promise? I really didn't know how to feel about this, but I told her I wouldn't tell anyone, and she thanked me as she hugged me goodbye. I left in my U-Haul, unsure how to feel about the situation, but I kept the secret. I didn't come home for the next year. I came home for Thanksgiving, as promised, but the whole thing felt uncomfortable. Mom and I sat downstairs eating, her curious about how school was going, and me filling her in on my studies. As I ate turkey and tried to have a normal conversation over stuffing, all I could focus on was the tap-tap-tapping from upstairs. Mom had closed the door to Dad's office, something that I could never remember happening at any time in my life. But despite her best efforts, the tapping was still audible. There was a smell from the room at the end of the hall, and I was worried about her living in a house with a decomposing body. She said he hadn't decomposed much, but I think she might have been trying to spare my feelings. Worse than the smell, though, was the tapping. It never stopped. It sounded too loud to be from whole fingers. Despite this, Mom was in pretty good spirits. She said that Dad's first book was being edited, and his publicist thought it was likely to be ready for shelves by next year. He couldn't believe my dad had been keeping this gem to himself for so long. And I think that's when I really realized how few people Dad had shared his book with. She said the initial payment on the book had allowed her to pay some overdue bills, and she would send him the second book sometime next year. If I release them slowly, it won't seem so odd when he finishes, and I let them know that he's passed. I asked if his writing had slowed at all, and she said that he was typing all day and night. He never rests, and I've had to start sleeping in my noise-canceling headphones. The sound takes some getting used to, but I think I can put it out of my mind. I had meant to stay the week, but I ended up making excuses and leaving the day after Thanksgiving. The sound of the keys as they clicked away was becoming too much for me to handle. After that, I made excuses not to come home. I told Mom I had a paper due during Christmas and stayed on campus over the holiday. I took extra classes so I didn't have to come home on the semesters that I'd be able to take a break from. I still called her on the phone, but our conversations became shorter and shorter as time went on. The longer I was on the line with her, the more pervasive the clicking became, and it felt like I could hear it over the phone no matter where she was. Mom's mental state began to deteriorate as well. She'd sent the second book to his publicist, and he'd fast-tracked it after the first one had done so well. She deflected any sort of interviews or phone calls for Dad, telling them how shy and anxious he was. But people really seemed to want to pick his brain about the direction of the books, and they were becoming harder and harder to put off. She didn't sound like her usual self either. It was clear that she wasn't sleeping. She said the clicking was getting louder and louder the longer it went on. I tried to do some soundproofing on the office, but it never seems to help. I can't stand to be in there for very long. Even though he's looking at the screen, I can feel him watching me when I'm in there. I think I can hear something moving around at night, too. Mom took a deep breath, and I could almost see her looking in the direction of the office as she pitched her voice lower. I asked what she meant, afraid that maybe animals had gotten in to try to get at Dad's body. But she said it was just little sounds. You remember how he used to leave his office late at night to get food? Sometimes I feel like I can hear someone coming down the stairs in the wee hours of the morning. While I was listening to it the other night, I realized that I couldn't hear the keyboard anymore, and that scared me even more. She started crying then, and I think I had already decided to come home that weekend so we could sort this out. I hadn't come home in a long time, and I found a very different woman than the one I had found over Thanksgiving a year before. And why not? It had to be nerve-wracking, knowing you were sharing a house with a corpse. Mom looked like she had aged 20 years. Her hair, light blonde the last time I'd seen it, was threaded with gray and looked thinner than ever. Her skin sagged, and her eyes looked bruised from the bags under them. She was so thin to the point of emaciation, and I wondered if she had been eating. When she hugged me, I could feel her ribs pressing against me, and I decided then that something had to be done before I lost both my parents. I told her that we had to end this. I told her that we had to put him to rest, but she feebly resisted. He isn't done yet. He's still typing up there. I can't lay him to rest until he's finished. I asked her how long that would be, but she didn't seem to have an answer. I told her I was tired and wanted to rest, but after I heard her door close and the sound of her springs grumbling as she went to bed, I got up and went downstairs. I wanted to see what this thing was that was moving around after dark, and I knew just the place to hide. There was a small closet in the living room, a place for wrapping paper and old crafts Mom hadn't gotten around to yet. And after sliding some things around, I made myself comfortable and cracked the door. It took some time. I wished I had some coffee to keep me from dozing in the small, warm place. I was just starting to nod off, my phone showing 3:30 in the morning, when the landing at the top of the stairs creaked. Something glided down almost soundlessly, its body light as I pressed my eye to the slit in the door to see what it was. It was dark in the living room, the curtains drawn, but I didn't dare turn on my light. If it knew I was here, it might flee, and then I'd have nothing to report to Mom in the morning. Luckily for me, it jostled right past the closet door, and the creature was impossible to miss. It It was thin, almost lacking dimensions, creaking as it ambled into the kitchen. I held my breath as it disappeared into the dim space, but the pale head was hard to miss. When it turned to look at the closet from the kitchen doorway, I feared I'd made a noise. When those empty eye sockets fixed on the door, I covered my mouth with my hands. When the creature creaked its way into the kitchen and disappeared from sight, I tripped out of the closet and made my way less than gracefully back up the stairs and into my old room. If it heard me, it didn't stop at the door to comment. Only then did I come to the same conclusion that my mother had, realizing what was missing from the silent house. The tapping had stopped. We called the police the next day, me threatening to call them myself if Mom didn't. I didn't know what that thing was I'd seen the night before in the kitchen, but I couldn't very well leave her alone with it. She just nodded and picked up the phone. I think she was ready to call them, honestly. She lived with Dad's corpse for 2 years, and even she had to agree it was time to end it. The paramedics weren't sure what to make of him, but he was definitely what I had seen the night before when it came into the kitchen. He had almost completely rotted, but his bones had moldering flesh still attached in places. His scalp had some hair clinging to it. The bald spot I had noticed was still visible, but we had taken his hands off the keyboard before they got there. When we had taken him from the computer, his scream was little more than a wheeze of protest. He had no vocal cords to scream with, but still, he protested. The police had questions, but I think Mom managed to convince them that it was all harmless. She said that when he died, she had just gone a little bit crazy. She couldn't cope with him being gone, so she just pretended he was in his office, typing away on his novel. I told them that that was what she had told me for months, and I think they believed me. Dad's remains were taken to the funeral home, and it goes without saying that his funeral was a closed casket affair. As we sat on the front row, though, I heard something that would haunt me until I went into the ground myself. Dad may not have been able to scream, but it seemed his work went on regardless. As I sat there with Mom, my mother sobbing as she heard the all-too-familiar sound, we both heard the low tapping of those bony fingers smacking against the lid of the coffin. I can only assume that they still press against the lid even now, my father's last story, worn into the wood of his coffin.
One last story. Then I think it might be time to put this fire out and go have a little nap. This one's an oldie but a goodie, and certainly in keeping with the weather we've been having lately. So, let's hear a little story about a strange creature that just happens to have come from one of my favorite places, a thrift store. Let's hear a story about the sweater.
I didn't want the sweater in the first place. From the first time I laid eyes on the damn thing, I knew it would haunt me until the day I died. I first saw it in a thrift store window when I was 10 years old. It was a lumpy green thing made out of thick yarn, an ugly monstrosity that looked like someone's grandmother had knitted badly. As much as I hated it, I was also drawn to it. Even as I stared, I thought I could see a pair of big, goggly eyes in the pattern. 2 sharp teeth floating amongst the swirls of thread seemed eager to bite me as I slid it on. The arms ended in little tassels that looked like claws, sharp claws that looked like needles. I hated it, but I was drawn to it in that way that children are drawn to anything that might end their perceived immortality. Mom must have noticed my interest. 2 weeks later, just as the autumn chill began to rise, she gave it to me one morning so I could wear it to school. She pulled it out from behind her back, flourishing it like the end of some magic trick. She smiled hugely, clearly thinking she had something I really wanted. My stomach dropped when I saw it, and I was again filled with a sense of dread that she must have picked up on. "It's the sweater you liked so much," she said, looking a little hurt. "You really seemed taken with it when you saw it back at the store." Mom didn't have the money to buy me much. Dad had left when I was a baby, and she worked as a waitress to put food on the table and a roof over my head. We didn't have a lot of money for presents, and I could tell that however much this sweater had cost was too much for me to act anything but grateful. I pulled it on, not really wanting it on my skin, but pretending it was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. It was made out of scratchy wool that I just knew at first glance would make me feel too warm. It rubbed at my skin like steel wool as it settled on my arms. It just felt wrong as it sat against my smooth skin, and I immediately wanted to take it off. It felt like there were bugs in it. As I walked to the door, I couldn't help but wonder if maybe roaches or earwigs had gotten into the fabric. She walked me to the bus stop, all the while smiling at me as I pretended the sweater wasn't the worst thing I'd ever worn. As the bus pulled away from the curve, I yanked it off and stuffed it in my backpack. My friend Mark looked at me strangely. "New sweater?" "Mom found it for me, but it's just about the most uncomfortable sweater ever." "I thought it looked kind of cool," Mark said, "like Slimer from the Ghostbusters." The movies were pretty popular around this time, and I had to admit that it did look pretty ghoulish. The pattern on the front, big teeth and bug eyes, did make it look a little like the green ghost from the movie, and we talked about it all the way to school. I forgot all about the sweater until I got home that afternoon. I found it crumpled at the bottom of my backpack when I got started on my homework. I took it out and laid it over my desk chair. As I sat to do my homework, though, it began to itch at me. I took it and tossed it in a chair by the closet door instead, getting back to work. Even having it against my skin made me feel weird, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder at it as I did my homework. It felt like it was looking at me somehow, staring at me with those huge bug eyes, and I felt haunted by it as it sat placidly. When Mom came home a few hours later, she seemed happy to see the sweater. "I knew you would like it. Was it warm enough today?" "Yeah, it was just right," I lied. I finished my homework and went downstairs to help with dinner. Typically, I would have sat in my room or watched television till dinner was made, but tonight, I just wanted an excuse to be out of my room, away from the sweater. My room felt invaded every time I looked at it, and I just wanted to be anywhere but there for a few hours. I didn't think about it again until it was time for bed. I came into my room, pajama bottoms and white undershirt on, with my mouth still feeling minty from the toothpaste. I was ready to climb into bed when I saw the sweater again. For some reason, I just couldn't stand looking at it anymore. I picked it up, the coarse fabric scritching at my hands, and tossed it under the bed. I knew it meant nothing, a meaningless gesture, but I didn't want it watching me while I slept. Mom came in and kissed my forehead. "Good night, honey," she said as she turned off the lights and closed the door. I burrowed down under the covers and started getting comfortably sleepy. It had been a long day, with another one to follow, and as I began to edge towards sleep, I started to hear a weird noise from somewhere in the room. It sounded like someone dragging wire across the hardwood, and as I focused my attention on it, I could hear the sound sliding across the boards. I sat in my bed and looked for it, that harsh slithering that wound its way over the flooring. As I cast my eyes over by the chair, I saw the source of the noise. It was the sweater. It was sitting on the chair where I had thrown it earlier, leering at me with its toothy grin. It couldn't be there. I had thrown it under the bed. But there it sat, as though I'd never grabbed it in the first place. Maybe I'd been wrong. Maybe I hadn't thrown it. Maybe I'd just imagined the whole thing, and now I was just scaring myself. I rolled over and tried to get back to sleep. As I tossed and turned, though, I could almost feel those bug eyes looking at me. I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block it all out. As I lay there, I imagined I could hear that wire dragging across the wood again. It was like the scratching of claws times 10, and I could hear it going under my bed and towards the wall. I peeked out from under the covers and looked towards the chair, making sure that hideous sweater was still there and not responsible for the noises. The chair was empty, though. I sat straight up and peered around the semi-dark, searching for the sweater. It couldn't have moved. It was a sweater. A stupid sweater. And even my 10-year-old brain knew the sweater didn't just get up and move around on its own. I looked over the edge of the bed, seeing nothing, and hesitantly hung upside down so I could glance under the bed. In my 10-year-old brain, that was where the monsters lived, and this sweater had become a monster now. I peeked, afraid to see it, but it wasn't there. Only a few toys and some dirty clothes greeted me. I looked back at the chair, still finding it empty, and snuggled down under the covers so I could get some sleep. I awoke in the morning to a terrible pain in my arm. The sweater was in bed with me, curled around my arm as though it had gotten tangled on me in the night, and I wrenched it off violently. I didn't want it to touch me. I didn't want it to contact my skin. As I came free, I saw the source of the pain. On my forearm, on the inside of my arm, was what looked like a bite. As I inspected it in the dewy morning light, I felt sure I could pick out individual teeth marks on the flesh of my arm. I looked frantically at the crumpled green garment in the corner and suddenly felt sure that it was the source of the bite. I ran downstairs to show my mom, who was just starting to get breakfast things together. She looked at the bite and declared it a rash. "Probably from your new sweater," she said, and I could hear real sadness in her voice. She still believed that I really liked that ghastly thing, and the thought that it had caused me pain made her sad. She said she would wash it today after school and have it back to me by tomorrow, and I remember hoping that it shrank in the wash. I thought all day about the terrible garment coming back too small or shredded by some fluke, and the idea brought me some little amount of joy throughout the day. When I got home, however, I heard the washing machine in full swing and found a note on the table saying that Mom had gone to get groceries. I figured she put the sweater in with the load and went upstairs to start my homework. Mark and Davy wanted to ride bikes later, and I knew that if I got my math done before dinner, I'd be able to go riding with them before the sun went down. When I opened the door, I was startled by the green sweater sitting on the chair where I had left it last night. I was angry at myself for a moment. Why was I so afraid of this stupid sweater? I grabbed it up, yarn digging into my hands like steel wool, and took it to the laundry room. I opened the washer and threw it inside, slamming the lid closed and stomping back upstairs to start my homework. I finished quickly, and when Mom got home, I went outside to play. I spent the afternoon riding bikes and jumping dirt ramps with my friends, and as the streetlights came on, I turned for home. When it came time for bed, I walked back up to my room to find the sweater back on the chair where it had been earlier. There was a stack of freshly folded clothes on my dresser, but for some reason, Mom had put the sweater back on the chair. I walked around the sweater as I got ready for bed, but I kept thinking I could see it move out of the corner of my eye. It didn't leave the chair, but I thought I saw the arms wiggle or the waistband shiver slightly as I walked around the room. I went straight to bed after lights out, and in the morning, I found more bites on my arm. 3 new bites, to be exact, each one on the underside of my arm, not on the outer arm where everyone might notice them easily, and each one looking much the same as the first. The sweater wasn't in bed with me this time, but I knew it had been the one to do it. Mom still thought it was a rash, but I was convinced that they were bites. For the next few weeks, I tried various measures to keep the sweater away from me. I left it in other rooms, sometimes with the door locked, but it always found its way back to my room. The closet was no obstacle at all for it, and twice I awoke to see it sitting in the chair as the door slowly closed behind it. One night, I stuffed it in the washing machine and closed the door locking behind it, and I still woke up the next morning to find it in my bed. My sleep started to suffer, and I found it hard to get a full night's sleep as I woke up to search for the sweater. My teacher told my mother that my performance was suffering, and I was given DRs several times for sleeping in class. If they'd seen what was under my sleeves, they would have probably had some questions for my mother, too. The bites were numerous, red and oozing blood sometimes. I kept them closely guarded, because if my teacher found out, I felt like my mother could be in big trouble. I kept them from both my teacher and my mother, not wanting her to ask questions either, and as it went on, our relationship became strained. She knew I wasn't sleeping well, but she wouldn't even entertain the idea that it was due to some evil sweater. She thought I was looking for attention, that I was just a typical child with an overactive imagination, but she couldn't take off work just to sit at home with me and protect me from a piece of clothing. At one point, she even threw the sweater in the garbage, thinking that would solve everything, but when it reappeared in my bedroom, she accused me of keeping it around to get attention. After 2 weeks of being terrorized, I decided to finally put a stop to it. That night, I stayed awake and watched it. The next day was Saturday, and I knew Mom wouldn't care if I slept in. I was going to catch it in the act and show Mom that it was hurting me. Maybe then she would let me get rid of it. I had a big metal flashlight with a thick blanket I was going to catch it in. I would hold on to it until it ran out of steam, and then show my Mom so she wouldn't think I was dreaming. I watched the red numbers on my Ninja Turtles alarm clock tick slowly by, and by 11:30, I was having trouble staying awake. The sweater hadn't done anything but sit there all night, and as my eyes got heavier and heavier, I found myself slipping towards sleep. I lost the fight before midnight, and woke up with my head against the blanket. I looked at the clock and saw that the numbers read 2:45 a.m. I swept the light around the chair and tried to orient myself. The beam fell on an empty chair, and I couldn't help but feel dread mounting. Where had it gone? Had it slipped off the chair while I was asleep? As I searched for it in the beam of light, though, I heard a familiar sound of wire scraping against the wood behind me. I turned the beam onto my headboard, and there was the sweater. I thought for a moment that I might be dreaming, but as the flashlight illuminated it, I had to come to grips with the idea that what I was seeing was very real. The bug-eyed pattern had become a real set of bulbous eyes. The green body was a voluminous mass of fibers and filaments, and the teeth had become large and snapping. It was perched on my headboard, clearly startled by the sudden intrusion of light. It emitted a loud, otherworldly scream as it leapt at my face, and I swung the flashlight without thinking. It smacked into it with a soft woof sound, and I watched it fall to the floor next to the closet. The beam fell on it again, and it scrambled across the floor as it frantically crawled for the bed. I sat on the bed and listened as it rustled beneath the box spring. I had glimpsed its true form now. I had seen the wicked teeth that had left marks on my arm, and I was not about to let it sink them into me again. I jumped out of bed, flipping on the lights, and scooped up the sweater as I headed down the hall. The hall closet was stuffed with old tubs for storage. As I wrenched open the door, I found what I was looking for on the second shelf. Mom had an old popcorn tin, the kind you give people for Christmas when you're not sure what else to give them. As I reached for it, I felt the sweater shriek and scramble towards me. It knew what I meant to do, and it knew that it would be stuck if I did. I grabbed it before it could latch onto me and stuffed it down into the metal guts of the tin. I was going to trap it in here for good, a good long time, and there wasn't a thing that it could do about it. In the light, it was just an ordinary sweater. I made use of this knowledge and stuffed it into the tin. I heard it thrashing around in the tin and held the lid closed as I looked around for duct tape or something else to keep the lid closed. A few layers of tape over the lid, and I felt confident that it wouldn't be able to escape. I stacked a few boxes on top of it for good measure and left it thrashing at the bottom of the closet. As I went to sleep, I could still hear it beating feebly at its prison walls. The noise was like a lullaby for my tired soul. I'd like to say that this is the end of the ordeal, but this story is actually my reason for writing it all. It's been 25 years since that night, and I had all but forgotten about it. I had put it off as the overactive imagination of a child, just like my mother had, until I came home from work today. After college, I moved several states away, taking a job as an architect for a big firm in Chicago. That's where I met Emily, and now we have a child of our own, my daughter Carrie. My mother loves her granddaughter and comes to see her whenever she can, but most of the time, my mother's presence is felt through her packages. Cookies, toys, anything to make my daughter smile. And when I got home today, I found one of those packages open on the kitchen table. The box was empty, but there was a note inside addressed to Carrie. "Hi, Carrie. Grandma was cleaning out the attic and found something she thought you might like. It was your dad's when he was your age, and he used to make up all sorts of strange stories about it. It looked so lonely when I found it. I thought you might have more use for it than me in the Windy City. Love you, Grandma." As I looked at the note, my blood ran cold. What had my mother found tucked away in the attic? I walked out of the kitchen and into the living room, catching sight of my daughter as she lay on the living room floor. She was coloring something in her binder, using her crayons to fill in whatever picture she had just drawn. At that moment, though, my focus was on the familiar green sweater she was wearing. The yarn was a little faded, but the bug eyes still stared at me, and the teeth smiled with that delirious mirth. As I stared, it seemed to say, "Hello, old friend. Thought you'd gotten rid of me, huh? But here I am. Time for our game to start again." Carrie turned around and smiled at me, springing up and wrapping her arms around me in a big hug. I had to stop myself from shuddering as the sweater touched me, and she stepped back a little so I could see when she was done. She did a little twirl so I could take in the whole thing, and it didn't seem to repulse her the way it had always repulsed me. "Isn't it great, Daddy? Grandma sent me this cool new sweater. I love it. It's so soft, and it's so warm." I didn't know what to say. I just nodded dumbly and walked back into the kitchen to fix myself a drink. After the second drink, I began to calm down a little, and I started writing this after my hands stopped shaking. I don't have a clue what to do. How do you tell your daughter that she's wearing something that tormented you for 2 weeks? How do you convey to her that something she loves is evil? What do I do when the bites start appearing? How do I rid myself once and for all of this evil sweater.
And just like that, our stories are at an end for another day. But don't be sad. We'll be back again very soon with more stories and more great times here on Cozy Horror. Till then, this is Dr. Plague wishing you a wonderful day and a spooky evening.